In this lesson, we're going to review the relationship between the macros function in Excel and the Visual Basic application. We're first going to understand the basic difference between a macro and the Visual Basic for application. Then we're going to compare the differences by generating a macro code and writing a code in VBA from scratch. To begin with, please understand that there's only a slight difference between macros function and the Visual Basic application, and in most cases, they can be used interchangeably. The primary difference between VBA and Macro is that the former is a programming language to create macros, which then runs on Excel or any other Microsoft application to perform automated tasks or to follow a set of instructions not originally included in the Microsoft application interface. Macro is the piece of code or recorded steps of user activity, where VBA is the programming language. Excel macros are recorded in VBA, so we can understand that macro is only a part of the overall VBA language. The confusion between the two can also be associated with the term macros that was already incorporated in Microsoft Access before VBA was introduced. It included a series of steps or instructions that were not stored as an editable VBA programming language. With VBA, the same was more dynamic, as people could easily view the code that was generated in the backend and trim the code to save space, as most of the times, unnecessary steps were recorded. Furthermore, the code generated could now be used to create more dynamic instructions for Excel to follow. In short, VBA stands for Visual Basic for Application, which is the computer software language which is used to create a macro. A macro is in turn a series of instructions that are either written manually with a high level of VBA language and syntax knowledge, or recorded through a macro option in Microsoft Excel, which also converts the recorded instruction into VBA language. Now that we know that we can use these terms interchangeably, our goal is to write macros either using the VBA language, the record macro option in Excel, or the combination of the two, so that we're able to generate codes that automate tasks and save time. Let's look at two different ways of generating macros for Excel. Let's review a simple example of how to automate Excel to copy data in some columns and then paste it in other columns. We'll also show you how to use the instructions to make your own customized sets of instructions for Excel to follow. We will be continuing from our previous lesson, Introduction to Macros from the Developer tab, where we introduced the Developer tab and the Macros interface. In that lesson, we generated a VBA code through a record macro technique by using both a relative reference and without relative reference. You can navigate to the code by going to the Visual Basic option from the Developer tab and view the code that was generated. You can replace the codes with the template codes that we are sharing in the lesson worksheet. These templates are for the copy and paste function of columns. The sample template of VBA code is for both with reference and without reference. You can manually edit it to get the same results, but this time the copied columns should be pasted in column G and column H. To make this task more interesting, we'll also use the code to copy column G and H and then paste it to column K and L. We're going to make it slightly more complicated so you can understand how to use a simple template and how that can be used to write multiple layers of code. In future lessons, we'll teach you how to insert codes yourself directly from Visual Basic. Another reason for making this example slightly more complicated is to show you that when we generate a code with the record macro function, we can then save time by editing the VBA code through simple logic rather than recording the macro for every custom situation. The template for the macro without using relative reference is explained in this lesson. It asks us to specify the columns and make it our selection. Then we copy the selection. Then we select a range and then paste the column on that selection. We're now going to edit the VBA code template that we have provided to achieve our requirement. We will input range A to B in the columns section to select both columns, and then select columns G and H, and then paste the copied columns there. We will now copy the code and paste it below to make the following amendments. We'll change columns A and B selected to G and H, and then select columns K and L, and then paste the copied columns there. This way, we have not only amended the code, but we also wrote another layer of the code without the need to record the macro all over again. Let's now review the template to accomplish this using the relative reference method. Please note that it is not as simple as the previous example, as it introduces an offset function. We're going to discuss the offset function in detail in an upcoming lesson, as it's critical in designing dynamic ranges so that our work is automated. The offset function is an instruction to Excel to move a certain number of rows and columns forward. There is also a difference from the previous code with the inclusion of active cell syntax. VBA coding is a programming language, but the text that it uses can be understood with a little bit of general understanding. For example, if it says active cell.select, we can understand that it is referring to selecting the active cell. Similarly, if we look at the current code, it first instructs to begin an active cell. In most cases, we usually start with cell A1, so that there's no confusion while running the code. After selecting cell A1, it asks to select the columns. We will select columns A and B. Then we instruct Excel to copy the columns as we did in the previous code. Then we instruct Excel to move some rows and columns forward. In our example, to reach column G, we will select rows as 0 and columns as 6 columns so that it moves 6 columns forward starting from cell A1. This will select cell G1 as the new active cell. We then paste columns A and B on the selected cell. We will now copy the code just like our previous example. Then we will use the offset rows as 0 and columns as 4 to instruct Excel to move 4 columns forward from the new active cell E1 to reach the cell G1. This will make G1 the new active cell. The last line of code will simply paste the copied columns on column K and L. Another point to note about VBA codes generated using relative reference is that every new range selected starts with A1, and every new column selected starts with A. This can confuse users who will select columns G and H, but the code syntax will show column A and B. You can now run these codes by going to the Developer tab and go to Macro. Then select the code that you want to run. Now you know the difference between writing code from scratch and using the record macro technique to generate a code, and you can use this to make changes to the existing code that you've written or created so that you can create further amendments to code without having to start writing a VBA code from scratch or recording a new macro from scratch. Simply use the existing VBA that you've prepared and iterate on it or build on it to create new macros. Hey guys, thanks for watching this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe from you. And if you want to learn more about Microsoft Excel, check out these videos above. And don't forget to check out our website, commercecurve.com, where we have lots of in-depth finance and accounting courses available with full training workbooks. All of our courses come with complete workbooks of lessons, examples, pre-built financial models, and training video. Hope to see you there.